So, hello everyone. Okay, welcome to my session, Drupalize your data, use entities. My name is Wolfgang Ziegler, or you might know me as Fago, which is my handle on the editor. I'm a Drupal developer from Vienna, Austria. I've been studying at the technical university there, and I'm doing Drupal since 2005. I'm one of the maintainers of the core subsystem form API and also the entity API. And I'm doing the entity API module in Drupal 7, as well as some other contrib modules like rules. You probably know that one. Yeah, that's it. So this talk is pretty much the same as I had already at the DrupalCon in Denver. So in case you have seen it there already, there might be not a lot of new stuff here for you, but yeah, some slides are a little bit different. So I'll start with a basic introduction, and I will talk a little bit about the concept of entities at all, and then we'll have a closer look at how you can actually interact with entities, and also how you can provide a new entity type in your module. Once we have seen that, we'll also shortly cover how you could make use of that same functionality for exposing data that's not sitting in your database. And lastly, I'll give an outlook on Drupal 8 stuff. So how is the API going to evolve for Drupal 8, and what is still planned for Drupal 8. Okay. So with Drupal 7, so for me the most important thing is pretty much that you can put fields on basically everything. So everything you can put fields on is an entity, as you probably know, but there are also some entity types which are not fieldable. So in Drupal 7 core, we also have vocabularies or file entities, which by default in Drupal 7 are not fieldable, but still they are working as entities, or they are entities in fact. That means entities can be fieldable, but they need not. Then in Drupal 7 we also have that concept of bundles. So I think bundles can be is best explained by just taking an example. So if we look at the entity type node as an example, the bundle in that case would be the node types. So it's just a kind of a further specialization. You could say it's a sub-entity type. And if we look at the entity type taxonomy term in core, in that case, the bundle is the vocabulary. So in practice, that pretty much has the meaning that you can put different fields on an entity if it has a different bundle. So a node of a different type has different fields, and it's the same for terms. It's just a general concept. And if we take another entity type, like the user entity type in core, there are no different bundles for that one. So that means there are just the same fields on every instance of that entity type. So that concept of bundles is optional to an entity type. So yeah, in Drupal core we have the entity types comments, nodes, taxonomy terms, vocabularies, user accounts, and files. But the set modules may extend that list and add new entity types to the system, and lots of Drupal 7 modules do that. So for example, Drupal Commerce makes a use of that a lot, so it adds a lot of new entity types to the systems, like products, line items, or customer profiles and stuff like that. Then also the organic group module implements a membership entity. Profile 2 implements profiles as separate entities. Then the heartbeat and message modules basically do activity streams, general message logs, where each log entry is an entity. And the file entity module just extends the already existing core entity type and makes it fieldable. So you see there are kind of some modules which add some entity types in contrib. But I think most important is in Drupal 7, it happens that there is a general shift from actually node-centric modules to entity-centric modules. So the modules get more and more converted to instead of just work with the node API, to generally work with fields and entities, and so the modules become even more useful and flexible. And I think that's really the biggest change that happened to Drupal 7, because lots of contributs basically have to be rewritten in order to fully gain the power of Drupal 7. So you may wonder what the modules are using the entity API for then. And the way I see it is that the entity API provides a unified way to access Drupal's data to the modules. So they can work with all the different data types that are in the system in a general fashion. So I've created that diagram which should help you to see how that works. So on the right side, actually, we have modules that implement some solutions. We have modules that implement voting, searching, or the organic groups functionality. And on the left side, we have modules which provides data to the systems, like the users, the nodes, or also stuff like profiles and products. And as everything is working with the concept of entities, the left side provides entities, and the right side makes use of the entities. Everything works together, and what is very neat is that way we save a lot of work because we don't have to do specific integration between each of the combinations. So that's pretty useful, actually. So let's have a look on how the solution modules can actually do that and work with entities. For that, the entity API module I've created in Drupal 7, which is a contrib module, helps a lot because it extends core a little bit and helps and adds quite some helpers for you. And so, in effect, it helps you with interacting with entities, but it also helps you with providing new entity types. But for now, have a look at how it helps you with interacting with entities. So in Drupal core, in Drupal 7 core, we mostly have the functionality of registering new entity types in hook entity info, and we have the functionality of entity loading in core. So if you introduce a new entity type, all the facilities for loading and registering it are in core, as well as some simpler other helpers as well, like to get the label of an entity type. But then the entity API module adds a lot of other helpers to that. As you see in the outer circle, there are helpers for saving an entity, for deleting, viewing, creating, or for checking the access of an entity. And in addition to that, and the module defines a metadata system for entity properties, which is entity get property info and an according hook, which then is used by the so-called entity metadata wrappers. And those are wrapper objects that help you to work with entities. I have some examples of that. So as you see in the first line with the entity metadata wrapper function, you basically wrap an already existing entity, or you just pass it the entity ID and it's get automatically loaded for you. And then you have an object which itself wraps the real entity object. And on that wrapper object, then you can call methods and just use the properties in a very simple way, and what makes it easier to deal with entities and fields in Drupal 7, as you don't have to take care of all the differences between properties, fields, working with the right language in the fields and stuff like that. So in the second example, we see that you can use chaining when you are working with the entity wrappers. You can just get the node author's mail address like that, and the author you get from the wrapper is itself a wrapper, so you can just use it to get another wrapper. And in the end, the mail address is still a wrapper, so you need to call the value method on it to get the real value, which is wrapped in the object actually. In the next line, you can see as the mail address is wrapped, you can also call the set method on it to just set a new mail address in the user object of the node author. And then as said, it works the very same way for fields and properties. So if you have a field, like in that example, field text, you can use it the same way. In this example, this would be a single field, so a single valued field. So you just get one single value from it. Then language is handled just like that, that it's always defaults to the default language of the entity. And if you want to use a different language, you just have to specify it. Like in that example, you call the language method, pass to it the language code, and then you can get and set property values or field values in that language. It also has some functionality for handling multiple value fields, and also entity references that are multiple. So in that example, you would just get the value of the tags field, which is itself multiple, so we will get back an array of term objects, which is automatically loaded for you. And the wrapper for this multiple field also supports array access, so you can just deal with it like a regular array. You can just add a new term object like that. And it's also all the metadata about fields and properties is available via the wrapper objects as well. So you can just call options list on a wrapper object, and you get back the possible options. Or it works the same way for getting the entity label or for checking entity access. This just makes use of all the other helpers that are available in the entity API module and makes them accessible for you on the wrapper objects. And for all the wrapper objects to work, there's that entity property info system I mentioned. It's basically a way to specify metadata about the properties you have on your entity. And this metadata includes fields as well. So this is implemented already in the entity API model for you, so you don't have to do something for that's work. It's working automatically for every field where the field type has added support for that. In that example, you see the metadata of the mail property of a user. So you see it just says something like, yeah, the label of the property, a data type, some descriptions. Then you can specify getter and setter callbacks. So you tell the system how it has to write and set the values on it. You can specify custom validation, the relation to the schema field in the back, and custom access callbacks for additional access check functionality. And then all that stuff is available via that same interface for fields and properties. So the property information really enables the unified access to entity data, as well as validation, as it also adds the access information. So you can validate the value of a property, and you don't have to care whether it's a field or it's a property. It just works the same way. So if we have a look at how modules actually make use of that, it actually turns out that quite some modules use it. So Drupal Commerce makes a lot of uses it a lot. So all the as Drupal Commerce highly builds up on entities and fields, it helps a lot to make the commerce code simpler, because you don't have to deal with all the field API internals like the different deltas and language codes everywhere in the code. And also modules like fused bulk operations and organic groups use the wrappers a lot. So that's mostly how they use property info. They just use it via the wrappers. And rules and the search API leverage the property information a bit more, I would say, as rules takes fully advantage of it for getting and setting properties. So everything you see in the rules UI that you can get and set is in the end just a call to the wrapper. It's really the same. And search API makes use of the property information to know what data is there. It can then index, and it also makes use of the wrappers to extract the data then. Then there are some web service related modules like RESTful web services, REST-WS, which makes use of all that property made data to expose that data in a meaningful way as a RESTful web service. And the WS client is it could be seen as a counterpart, which is useful for calling web services which have been defined based on property information. Then microdata and the RDFX modules make use of the property information to put the RDF mappings in there and to annotate whether they should take care of that property or not. Then there is an entity tokens module, which is part of the entity API module, which completely builds up the wrappers and the property information to generate tokens for all the properties. That means once you have the property registered for your entity type, you automatically will get a token for it, and you don't have to write the token integration yourself. And there's also some fuse integration, which leverages all that stuff. So that fuse integration is able to show data of entities without actually having to query for it. So it just makes an entity load and displays the data then. And via that, basically you can show everything that is an entity. And what is very neat, if you have already an entity implemented, then you just need to add your filtering stuff. And also Search API makes use of that functionality, allows to implement its own fuse integration, and also the entity field query fuse implementation, it does that as well. Okay, so what's necessary to provide a new entity type? For that, the central place in Drupal is hook entity info, where you first have to register your entity type, and you have to specify a controller class there. The controller is that piece of thing that takes care of loading an entity. And in core, it only takes care of loading an entity, as only loading is in core, and the entity API module extends that so that the controller takes care of the full CRUD functionality. So it also takes care of saving, deleting. Yeah, and then in addition to that, for the controller to work, you usually have to implement hook schema. So if you want to leverage the entity API module, you basically just have to do that 3 steps. You implement hook entity info, you specify the controller class of the entity API, and you specify your properties in hook schema, and that's it. You get a fully working entity type, and you can use it like that. So you have the basic functionality, the CRUD functionality in place. You can use entity create for creating a new entity object, and as the entity API module also has support for cluster objects, you can then directly work with the cluster object and save it and delete it and use all the other helpers that are available for it. Then that's only the CRUD functionality, but the entity API module also helps you with integrating your entity type more with all the other contrib modules. And it works like that. So you start with the entity information, the CRUD controller, and the schema, as said. And then the system already takes care for invoking the field API for you, so you have nothing to do there. Then there is property information generated already for you. So the entity API module takes a look at your schema, and it tries to come up with some useful entity property metadata for you. But this metadata is very basic, as not everything can be read out from the schema. So you usually have to add something to that, and you have to complement that. For example, if you have a node, in the node you have the user ID, which is the reference to the author, but the module cannot know it from the schema, so you have to tell it that it's actually a user reference. So you have to annotate stuff like that to fully leverage further functionality. For example, given fuse integration. The fuse integration is totally generated for you and works out of the box, so you usually don't have to add something to that if you write a new entity type, as long as you have specified property information. So if you have a relationship, you just have to make sure that you have specified the property information. Then the entity API is able to generate the fuse integration for you. And also, I guess I should mention that all that integration work is done via separated controller classes, which can be enabled and disabled in hook entity info. And if you want to customize something of that, it's possible, quite simple, that you just extend the existing controller class, do your customizations, and specify your own controller class. So that way you can leverage all the stuff that is generated for you by default, but you have still full control and can change everything if you want. Then as said, the entity tokens module will integrate tokens for you. That will also happen automatically once you have specified proper property information, and rules will leverage that as well. So nothing to do there as well. But the really nice part is that once you have implemented all the foundation and you have specified proper property information, you possibly gain integration with lots of other additional modules, like I said, modules like REST, WS, that just work on top of the property information. They will just work out of the box, and you don't have to care about integration with them. Then there's also something like that's called exportable entities in the entity API module. That's basically an alternative to ctools exportables. You probably know. It should be noted that to lots of developers in the community, that's a bit a controversial topic because some think it doesn't make sense conceptually to expose configuration as entities. Functionality-wise, there's nothing speaking against it, and I found it very useful. So I'll do it for now, but it's up to you whether you think it's a good solution for you or not. And what it brings to you is that you can leverage the same unified CRUD interface, all the neat entity create API functions and stuff like that for your configuration objects as well. You'll get all the regular CRUD hooks, so you get insert, update, preserve hooks, and delete hooks, what can be very useful when you need to be able to react on configuration changes in your system. And that's possible because the entity API exportable implementation actually takes a little bit different approach than the ctools exportables, in that it synchronizes all defaults that are provided in code in the database, what ctools exportable doesn't. And when the configuration item is synced in the database, all the hooks will be invoked for you. So for you, the API is totally transparent as to a regular entity. And having all the stuff in the database is also very neat if you write some administration UI and stuff like that, because then you actually can rely on the database for your interface if you want, and you can query and so on. Then the exportable entities also come with an optional administration UI, which you can just enable. You have to implement the form for your entities, but except for that, basically everything gets generated for you. We'll have a look at that later on. And also there's features integration. There's an ITN integration controller, which helps you with ITN integration, so you can just specify your properties there, and they will be exposed to ITN. Yeah, and there is also the regular integration, entity integration stuff if you think it's useful for your type of objects. So you can also do, make use of the views integration controller and token stuff and so on. So when we look at how this plays together for the exportable entity, it's very similar. You just provide hook entity info, you specify your CRUD controller, in which case you have to specify a different one because there's a specific one where the exportable functionality is implemented. So you just specify the entity API exportable controller, the schema, and you're done. Then the property information is again generated out of it, which you should probably improve, and all that other stuff works on top of that. Yeah. So speaking of the admin UI, if you know the Profile 2 module, the Profile 2 module admin UI is basically one-to-one the admin UI you get generated from the entity API. So it looks like that. It's just a regular admin screen as you know it from Drupal 7, where you can edit everything, clone, delete, manage fields, stuff like that. Yeah. So if we have maybe we have just a closer look at the Profile 2 module, because it's a good example of what the Entity API module can do for you and how it plays together. So in Profile 2 module, we actually have two entity types. There's one which is for the actual profiles, the profile entity type, but there is also an entity type for the profile types, which serve as the bundle of profiles. So you can have different type of profiles, like a customer profile and a community profile on the site. And for that, you just define different types as you do it for nodes. And the profile types are implemented as a separated entity type. And this is configured to be exportable. So you can export it to features, and all the admin UI and all that is generated on top of it. And also the Entity API module takes care of the bundle relationship between the two entity types, and it calls all the field API attachers for you, so you basically don't have to care about that. It's solved by the Entity API module. So if we look on the Profile 2 module, so kind of conceptually what it has to take care of, it mostly has to take care of the CRUD functionality and the field stuff. Then it has to take care of providing permissions and checking the access. You have to implement the form and the display of the profile entity, as well as then the administration UI for the admins. And then you have to add all the integration to all the contrib modules. And if we have a look at that, basically the Entity API module does all of that except of permissions, access, profile forms, and display. So the other stuff is handled by the Entity API module, but what you have to take care of is implementing the form for editing the profile. Then for displaying the profile, you have to implement that. You have to provide the permission, and you have to implement the Entity API access callback so it actually knows how the permissions apply to your entity type. That's it. And I think that's already pretty neat, as a lot of the stuff is already generated for you. So let's have a look how we can leverage that even a little bit more. And I think what's most exciting about this is that it's not tied to the database anymore. Well, we have that abstraction of entities, and we have the controller, which is the place that talks to the database. So if you want, you can use the same API and write your own controller, which then talks to NoSQL databases, and it will just work very same way with the system. Or you can also implement, make use of other libraries like Doctrine or PHPCR. Or if you think of a use case where you have multiple Drupal installations, you could expose the entities from one side as remote entities to the other side. So you can actually load the entity from another side just transparently via web service calls, stuff like that. And speaking of that, it's also very neat for doing data integration. So you can just integrate third-party services by entity types. So you just implement your own entity controller where you talk to your own third-party service, and it's automatically exposed the entity to the system, and all the module integration will work for it as well. What is a little bit problematic is fields, because fields have their own storage controller, so naturally they would talk to the database. So for now it's simplest to just leave fields out. If you do something like that and have a remote entity, for example, then you could just work with entities and properties, what means you won't gain all the field widgets and stuff like that. If you really want to do that, you could do your own field storage controller. I think there's even a prototype which does that by Damien Dunant, which then lets the field storage work via the entity storage. But that's kind of experimental, I would say. Yeah, so how does it work in the case of non-database entities then? So that the structure now has a little bit changed in that we don't provide schema information anymore. Instead, you just define your entity in hook entity info. You specify and implement your CRUD controller, and instead of the schema information, you only specify property information. And then again, all the modules can leverage that, and views integration, rules integrations, tokens, and all that stuff will work. Also, search API will work, so you can just index your remote entities, and then you also gain querying capabilities for them. So, using the entity API also for integrating remote data and stuff like that, buys us that we can use the API we are already used to, or the class CRUD API, or the CRUD hooks will be available for it as well. We'll have tokens, and you can use all the contrib modules that work with entities. So you can reference to a remote entity using the entity reference fields. You can use rules to automate stuff, or the rules link module, which provides a link where you can, like with the flag module, just trigger some functionality, index the entities with search API, expose it again as via web service. Yeah, so lots of possibilities. So yeah, go ahead, Drupalize your data. I also have done a prototype which you could have a look at to see how that actually works. So I've implemented entities for Google Picasa images and for albums. It's in the sandbox, which you can find under that URL. So if you're interested in that, just check it out. And it looks like that. So what you see here is just a view which just lists that remote entities. So on the left side, it's just a rendered entity field of the photo entity, and on the right side, it's just the entity label of the album entity. And those two entities have a reference, so they relate to each other, so you can also make use of that reference in the view, so just as an entity load in that case. Pardon? No, it's not an image field. No, it's a plain property which is exposed as field. Yeah. So as I said previously, from your non-database entities which work for remote storage, fields are more difficult. So it's simpler to leave it out. And yeah, so you don't have the functionality of fields. But yeah, if you want to have to do that, you could try to. It's more experimental. Yeah, and of course you can also do tabular views and everything like that, and you see properties for count of comments, the height, the size of the photos, and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest you to check out the code and to see how it works. It's pretty simple. To just implement the controller and that's it. And yeah, of course, there's room for improvements. In addition to that, what's already there, it would be very nice to have a display of the entity automatically generated, so that you can specify some properties, and you also get the default display for that generated. As of now, you have to write it yourself. And also the form, as I told you, you have to care about writing the form yourself. What makes sense in some parts, as usually you want to customize it anyway, but still it would be useful to have some reasonable defaults to be generated. And also there's currently no read-only mode for entities, so you can just expose read-only entities to the system, but nothing is aware that it's read-only, but usually isn't a big deal, but we might want to add specific support for that. Okay, so that's it basically from the Drupal 7 side, and as said, in the end I would like to give a short outlook on what's planned for Drupal 8 and what we are working on and what's already in Drupal 8. And first off, what's really cool I think is that in Drupal 8 we already have classed objects in core. So we have an entity interface in core, and all of the core entity types are converted. So we actually have a node class, we have a comment class, we have a taxonomy term class and stuff like that. And we have an entity API which supports full CRUD functionality. So the code examples over there, they actually already work in Drupal core with Drupal 8. So it's very similar to that, what's now in the entity API module. And if we have a look at how comments are structured in Drupal 8, as said, we have now a comment class, which just extends an entity class. The entity class then itself implements the entity the entity interface, and it provides some reasonable defaults you can make use of, so you don't have to implement it again for each entity type. So in the comment class, basically everything that's in there is that it specifies the properties that a comment has, and it implements the label method. No, it doesn't implement the label method. It actually implements the ID method, so that you can call entity ID and it gives you back the comment C ID. Yeah. And there's the comment storage controller, which handles all the storage customizations which are specific to comments. And again, we have an entity database storage controller in core, which comes with reasonable defaults, which does full CRUD for you automatically once you have specified an entity type with schema, just as it works in the entity API module now. So that is pretty much where we are now. That's already done. What we have been more thinking on and starting to work on now is an entity property API for Drupal 8, where the idea is that we have a unified API that allows you to deal with properties and fields the same way. So it's kind of making fields and properties the same, so you don't have to differentiate between those two anymore. And also based upon that, we are thinking and working on getting improved API into core, which works very similar to the entity metadata wrappers I've shown previously, but much improved in that you don't have to wrap anything anymore. So you just have the entity object, and it will have support for all that accessors and for all that simple stuff to access the properties of the entity and so on. Yes, then for that we also will have the property definitions and metadata system in core. So that's everything fleshed out and planned, but it's not implemented yet. But it's kind of involved in a lot of all the core initiatives, so it's relevant to the multilingual initiatives in that we can make every property translatable. It's relevant to the WISC initiative in that we can have an easy way to provide all the data of an entity in a web service, so you actually know what data is an entity. For that we have then the definitions. And also for content staging, because content staging needs to be aware of the data it stages and all the references in there, so it actually can deal with that in a proper manner. There's also work done to add UUIDs to entities, what's also very important for content staging. And yeah, of course, it will bring you improved developer experience as we can just leverage all the neat APIs, which is similar to the entity metadata wrappers, but built in. Yeah, so if you're interested more into that, which is really more on the planning and architecturing phase and doing first implementations now, I would suggest you to have a look at the recently posted report from the WSGI Web Services for March sprint, which you can find under that URL. And there are more details into how that all the entity property API is supposed to work and how it's planned currently. So if you're interested in that, check that out. Okay, so any questions on that or on the Drupal 7 stuff? So.
It seems that SQL is really bad at document storage because you need one table per field. So when do you think we'll be able to use a NoSQL or document storage solution just for any entity and any field type?
Currently, work is done to unify the field storage and the entity storage controllers, so that the field storage also goes for the entity storage controller. And I think once that's done, that's much easier to do them. And basically, all you have to do is to write your own storage controller and the necessary querying API for that. and then it is going to work really good. And so that's one goal for Drupal 8 to enable that. What is a little bit harder for is to be able to actually switch that for existing entity types. So in order to be able to make that pluggable, so that you can say you can choose whether you want the node in the database or in a NoSQL store, is a little bit farther away, I would say. So in the near future, you will gain the capability to do it for your own entity type, but whether we will achieve it for Drupal 8 so that it's really pluggable for nodes as well, we'll see.
I have a question in entity, like entity, when you reference with references, when you access properties of the reference, does it load those references when you access those or always? Like I have a user reference field, and if I want to get a UID, just a UID, not the user whole object, does entity reference, can I get my UID without loading the user object?
Yeah, so in the metadata wrappers, that's possible. However, you will have to use the methods for that. So there's a method to get the identifier of the entity object, and when you use that and it's not loaded yet, it won't load. But if you access something else where it needs to load the entity object, it will load. And when it's loading, it will also take care of multiple loading. So if you actually have a multiple entity reference field, it will make use of an entity load as in multiple ways. So it loads all the entities at once because that's much more performant.
Thank you.
Question? Yeah. I was surprised you didn't notice ECK. I like to use it. I think it's nice that it helps to build the stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I really like the idea of ECK. I must say that I personally haven't used it and I have no experience with it, so I can't really say much about it. But I really like the idea of doing that, yeah. So maybe someone else in the room has more experience with it.
And no plans for Drupal 8 to have something like that, or?
There have been some ideas about that, but that's it. So I don't think that anyone is currently really planning to work on that. But I think for the beginning it's fine to experiment with that in Contrib more, and if it turns out to be really a solid and reasonable solution in Contrib, then why not get it into core as well? Yeah.
And do you follow how the adoption of the concept of entities in other modules, in other Contrib? Like
like doing statistics on that? No, I don't do that, but yeah, it would be very interesting. So if someone is good in doing statistics, it would be awesome. Yeah, in particular to see how many modules already have done the shift from being node-centric to entity-centric, and how that rate evolves would be very interesting to see. Yeah. Some more questions?
So it seems a lot of fields are just really a connection to an entity. So for example, with file fields, it's an entity, or there's other examples like that. Should every field that is just referencing an entity, should it just be an entity reference field?
In the case of file fields and image fields, it's a bit special, as you have additional properties in the fields sitting there. Like for the image field, you have the alt text or the image description there, I think. So it's not only an entity reference field. But yeah, I think something like an entity reference field in core would be very reasonable. So I would agree with that, yeah.
What about entity cache module? Should that be in core?
Yeah, there's already work done on that basically. So there's an issue to split the cache controller out of the storage controller, so you don't have to care about caching in your storage controller. And then the cache controller is already pluggable, and you can just use a regular cache backend for it. Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense to do that instead of field caching, just cache on the entity level. More questions?
So, any question?
Okay then, thank you.
Thank you.